And just before introducing Barbara, I just want to mention how our two realms of research link up. Barbara and the hospice staff accompany what Paul Beard called the pilgrim, the soul, the spirit, up to the door of the eternal, so to speak. I mean, that's how it's often talked about. So she accompanies the person up to that door, and then what I don't think Barbara can see this, but on the other side, there's a team that receives the spirit, as we all know. And Matthew Ward was part of that team. I just finished writing on Matthew Ward. So it's like a handoff. Barbara brings the soul to the door of the eternal, so to speak, the transition point, and a team of spirit are on the other side to receive the soul, take them to the etheric realm for getting used to it all and getting accustomed to the truth, and then on to the astral plane, probably. So we're a handoff. Barbara will hand off to us, so to speak, and that's the relationship. And with that, I've known Barbara for about 10 or 12 years, Barbara, I guess, way back in, were you in the discussion group, Global Galactic Roundtable?
No, if we met, my first program with Linda Dillon was in 2012. But prior to that, I was reading your Golden Age of Gaia. Her, every Wednesday or twice a week, she would do something online where
right.
she would.
Hour with an Angel and Heavenly Blessings.
That's correct. Yeah, those are the names. So 2010 to 2012 is when I would have started knowing you.
Yes, wonderful. So now I've only learned recently about your hospice career. Maybe you could start by giving us a bit of a capsule history on hospice care and on your relationship to it, how you came to enter it.
Okay. Well, so many of you, well, those of you from the UK may have heard of Cicely Saunders, Dame Cicely Saunders, in 1948. She, who is a nurse, a social worker, a doctor, and a writer, met a man and started thinking about comfort care and quality of life, and started recognizing that we needed hospice care separate from the hospitalization care, and that people should be allowed to go home to die. It took until another, 20 years before the book, the popular book, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying was written. And she brought in another area of consideration and how writing about the effects of imminent death on the family, the patient, the staff, and recognized that this needed to be honored specifically. In the United States, of course, this is where I am. So in 1978, a national hospice and palliative care organization was developed. 83, the hospice benefit was identified as needing to be established by President Reagan. And then Clinton actually got the Medicare to recognize it as a hospice benefit. And now we bring in the insurance companies and the government creating a system so that people's death and dying could be paid for. And that's basically how they, so let's see, from 1993, in 1996, I was living in Colorado. I had had my own spiritual awakening in 1996, learning about Reiki and a million other things. I went to a psychic, and I had never heard of, I didn't know anything about psychics. But I had great recommendations to meet a woman who then said to me, not only can you learn Reiki, but there's a Reiki practitioner in your town. And I lived in a remote town in Colorado, an hour away from any other big town. It was in a frontier community where you have less than 3,000 people in an entire county. So up in the mountains, and I said, oh my God, how exciting. And 2 days later, I met the woman who began to change my life. In 1998, my ex-husband was suffering and dying, and the hospice experience that my mother-in-law and my sons and I endured was horrific. So it gave me the idea of, if I ever did this, I would be better at it. And 2 years later, when I came back to Chicago, and three different people in a 2-week period who didn't know each other, each said to me, "You'd make a great hospice nurse." So I came back to Chicago looking for a job, and that's what I started doing. I needed to do a lot of education for myself because I had been in chronic care, and I did not know the acute care diagnoses and the trajectory of people's illnesses and all of that. So luckily, my Loyola nursing education came through for me, and the computer was available, and I did a lot of research, and it became a joy to me to help people. I had already been in the chronic care arena with rehab and adolescent psych and public health, and communicating with families was a dynamic that I enjoyed. Teaching was a dynamic that I enjoyed, and I quickly learned that teaching was the crux of a good hospice experience. If the nurse can teach the family what to do in their absence, and the family is able to manage the symptoms with the proper medication, and the patient has a peaceful death, comfortable, peaceful death, that's where I got my job satisfaction, was knowing that I set them up to be able to handle that well. It was their experience with their loved one that needed to be given the greatest opportunity to be a success. And so it was my job to be a good teacher. And I enjoyed it so well, I did it well. And I stuck with it for 20 years. I would have kept working too. In 1971, in October, when they demanded the shots, the flu shot, and then they were going to demand the vaccines, I quit because I wouldn't do it. So anyway, I was actively still working at age 71.
Good. Wonderful. You call your book Demystifying Hospice, and you name a number of myths. The one I was very much interested in, what you said about it, was that the myth that morphine kills. Could you discuss that a bit? Maybe even if we have time, just read the list of things that we don't think about that
I would very much
happens.
appreciate that. 9 out of 10 patients are afraid of morphine for one reason or another. And it occurred to me to write this in the book in a manner that would trigger people to pay attention. So I identified, well, somebody said they gave morphine and then my loved one died. And so after all these years, I have experienced and worked with families and patients to help them understand what might the symptom or the relationship be between the morphine, the comfort level, and the death. So I will read that to you. They gave the medication and then the patient died. But what happened during that in-between time? A patient's pain was relieved. A patient's breathing was no longer labored. A patient's anxiety was reduced. A patient's agitation went away. The patient saw a deceased relative welcome them. The patient realized they didn't have to be afraid. The patient was welcomed by a figure central to their religion and was not afraid. The patient recognized that they were forgiven for all their transgressions. The patient spirit let go of the need to stay alive for somebody else. That was a biggie, by the way. The patient took the hand of their deceased spouse, child, parent, or lover and left with them. The patient reviewed their life's happy moments. The patient reviewed their life's sad moments, but saw them as lessons learned. The patient realized they didn't have to be afraid of the medicine. But you see, I didn't start with that. It came to me later. This is almost like, as it occurred to me to think about this idea, these things fell into place. And so the whole medicine wasn't even the top thing. I'm pleased about that. Okay. The patient saw the bright white light that so many others have reported and felt at peace. The patient recognized that all their family members would be fine and that their dying was not going to be a crisis for them. The patient recognized that their family members have been fantastic about ensuring the quality of their life during the dying process, and when they are gone, the family will not have to do that any longer. The patient accepted their desire and ability to let go, and then they died.
You remember Kubler-Ross saying, giving the story of the young boy in the living room, and he was dying. And one day his little brother Frankie came in and said, gee, you know, I wish you'd just hurry up and go because I'd like to watch TV. And the next morning the boy was gone.
Oh, that's adorable.
You mentioned, sorry, go ahead.
I would just like to mention, I'm open to questions along the way here. It can be reserved till later, or if I say something, especially if I say something that triggers somebody, which you brought up, Wendy, earlier. My book is a down and dirty nuts and bolts book. So I'm very frank about what I talk about in here so that I can be direct, but I am addressing all the information to the layman. It is not, it's for the professionals, of course. But if anybody does have a question, I'm happy to answer.
Yes, I definitely feel. I just wanted to mention what you had said now because I just lost a friend that was very adamant. He did not want to have morphine. And then when he fell unconscious, morphine was given to him and had such a hard time. Part of me felt like they killed him with that morphine. So I'm glad you mentioned all the positive things. I just wanted to say that.
Oh, thank you, and thank everybody's angels and guides for saying to me it's time to open this up for questions.
Hi, I eventually would like to get into this sort of work because I just think that it's very needed. So what exact qualifications do you need? Because you said that you were talking about Reiki, and nursing and a bit of mental health stuff. So what qualifications do you need to be able to do this?
Well, are you a nurse?
No, I'm studying psych.
Psych? Okay,
Yeah.
well, the personnel that are hired for hospice agencies include doctor, nurse practitioner, registered nurse, social worker, chaplain, aides, and then volunteers. So if you do not have one of those credentialed licenses recognized by a qualifying agency, it's going to be hard for you to find a place doing that, although the volunteer job is very, very wonderful. And yet every agency has many volunteers who they train specifically to first get hold of understanding their own grieving process, and so that they don't end up getting triggered while working for somebody else. And then they can be sitting with the patient for 1 hour a week, 2 hours a week, give the family a relief to get out the door, but they don't do any physical care. They're just there to talk with the patient about whatever they choose to talk about during their visit time. And that role is very essential, especially for people who have no other family around while they're going through the process. They could be in a nursing home and they need company, and volunteers are great for that.
Okay, thank you very much for answering my question.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, and I don't want to waylay the conversation, Barbara, but I just had to speak up because it's so important. And I definitely will look up your book. I work for palliative care and hospice at Dartmouth, and I've been in the hospice setting, and I think that the point you make is so important about demystifying the medications. Mm-hmm. And it gets even more amplified when you go into the area of medical aid and dying and but it's so interesting because with Wendy and Victor and Karen and this platform, we're talking so often about once we get to the other side, but you're really speaking about such an important point, which is that road to get there. And I think it is such a misunderstood place. And I think we have a fear-based, in broad sweeping generalization, we have a fear-based framework. So I just want to thank you for your contributions today. I'm very intrigued. And I will pass along your book title to the docs that I work with.
I am so excited too, Cheryl. Thank you very much.
So in one of your chapters, Barbara, you talk about having mystical or metaphysical experiences during this time. Can you talk a bit about that, please?
Well, it's just so exciting to work with patients who begin talking to someone else who's not in the room. And when that happens, I think about it very specifically because there is the reality that we have to tell the family to expect it. And there are times when the family doesn't agree and doesn't believe that there's an afterlife. And patients don't necessarily believe that there's an afterlife. One of my examples in the book is a man who was Jehovah's Witness, who, upon questioning about what do you think happens after death, he said, Jehovah's Witnesses say that's the end of it. You're dead, you're buried, that's the end. There is no afterlife. There's no heaven, there's no hell, there's nothing else. Well, a month later down the road, see, people can be still communicative and go to the bathroom in hospice. They don't have to be on death's door to be a part of a hospice agency. So he is, one of his grandsons was walking down the hall hearing him speak to someone. And so he opened the door. Now, we had already had the meeting with all the family members to prepare them for this possibility. And he said, Dad, who are you talking to? Granddad, who are you talking to? And he says, oh, Mom's here with me. Don't you see her? So the patient was seeing that as such a reality. He actually asked the grandson, did he see her? And he said, no, but I'm so happy for you that you are talking with her. It was another couple of weeks before the patient said, you know what? I'm about ready to go. I just thought I'd let you know. Mom is welcoming me, and pretty soon I'm going to go. It was 3 days later that he became very, very weak and tired and stopped eating and drinking and lay down on the bed. And the family became very aware because this was such a change in his medical condition. He literally just kind of slowed down and stopped everything. He didn't have a dramatic pain experience or any of the rest of that. So they were there with him saying, Dad, we love you. Whenever you're ready, go ahead. And he raised his arms up like this. He's laying down. He raised his arms up, grasped somebody, took his last breath, and his hands rested on his chest, and he died. So, you know, talking to the patient who will say to you, I just saw the little blue boy, the famous painting, Blue Boy, I think, you know, the blue velvet outfit. He was standing in the hall, and over him was a giant Native American, and I could literally see Blue Boy between the legs of the Native American, and they're having a conversation. Strange, unusual things. And then the kind of thing that happens most often is a patient will report being welcomed by somebody. They will consider it a dream. It happened overnight. And the one situation where here we have a family member who was not present when we did the original education about this. So he was with his mom, and it was day two or three of her experience of having this very same dream. Dad came to me. He was sitting there on the park bench. He had his red golf hat on and the beautiful park behind him. And he said, come on, darling, it's time. And she was afraid to go with him. She was afraid this was not real. She's a person who didn't even want to accept morphine because she was Roman Catholic, and she thought that morphine is understood to be suicidal behavior if you take morphine. So that's how out of touch and uneducated she was about medical stuff. But so I came in the next day, and she was very agitated. And she had refused her medications and her meals. And I asked her what was going on, and she said, is it possible? I mean, can this really happen? And I said, absolutely. And I used the word dream for her because that's what she used it and called it. And I said, this is very, very common. And I explained it all, told her to feel at warm and loved and cared for, and that she was halfway between this dimension and the next. So if it happens again, please feel free to do it. And in the meantime, I'll talk about this with your son, and I'll help him know that it's really, really normal. Well, the son was wonderful. He felt terrible about disturbing his mom. So he went in and talked with her, and he said, Mom, I'm so sorry, but when you mentioned that red hat, it all came back to me. Of course that was Dad. He was making this whole thing up in order to make her feel content and safe with him. The patients who are addressed by family members that deny their delusional, multidimensional reality think that the person is a monster. They will be afraid of them. They are afraid that they're being poisoned. They will not accept medications, turning and positioning, food, anything. It is a very, very serious issue. So over those years, as I learned that, I became more and more adamant about every family member learning to expect us and to give the family member, whether they believed it or not, just say, yes, that's so terrific, Mom, I'm happy that's happening for you, or whatever. But you have to let them know that you believe it, you accept it, and that it's normal.
Very interesting. Very interesting talk. Thank you very much for coming on. When my father passed away, he was on morphine, and because he had pancreatic cancer, and I noticed that every so often he would shake, slightly. And I'm wondering, is that painful, or is it just a shaking feeling, or I'd just like to know more about that. Thanks very much.
Well, tremors and shaking can be from a lot of other metabolic processes going on. As your organs are more and more diseased, the normal process of appreciating the electrolytes and the food and the nutrients that you need to feed your nerves and your circulation, they are changed dramatically. And having tremoring experiences is not at all uncommon. When they have tremoring experiences, many times we will add a medication to relax them, to deal with what could be understood as agitation. So I hope that answers your question. There's no one answer to your question. I don't think it was the morphine. I think it was the body process he was going through at that time as his organs were shutting down.
Barb, can you go for us in a very general manner over the hospice process as it is today? In like what happens when a person approaches you or their relative does?
Well, usually it's a doctor who will talk to the patient and say, the curative treatments you've been working with are not working, so we need to have you consider hospice care instead. It might be a palliative care nurse, it might be a neighbor, it might be a relative in your family, it might be the patient themselves who says, I've been going through this for so long, I just don't want to do it anymore. I'm accepting that death is near. I'd rather do it peacefully. No more chemo, thank you, or whatever other medications might be going on. Then an agency is called and meets with the patient and the family, and the first week is very, very intense with them explaining who's who in a hospice process, and I named those professionals earlier, and what each of them does. And the visits with the nurse and the aide who comes to do the bathing will be it's usually 2 or 3 per week, depending on the diagnosis of the patient. It increases to 7 per week when somebody is actively dying. In the period from admission, they will gradually go through a physical decline, and we call that process the decline. The ongoing care involves the nurse and the aide twice a week. The social worker and the chaplain, boy, they're very, very important, and the family decides how often they want to meet with either of those professionals. Some people love chaplains, some people say, well, I'm really spiritual and I don't go to a church anymore and I don't want you to come and talk to me about religion. Our chaplains are educated about every possible spiritual understanding, every culture's spiritual understanding, how the Muslims handle death, the Jews, everybody else. So we encourage them to at least give the chaplain an opportunity to come and meet with them and meet them on their level and give them the kind of support that they need. The social worker handles a lot of things, including finances, because there's a point at which anybody in their home or a nursing home is going to have a change in their condition, and they're going to require 24/7 attention, possibly every 2 to 4 hour attention, giving medications, turning them, whatever needs to be done. So if they need to be moved to a nursing home because the family doesn't have enough family members to provide that service, or if they can afford to bring in an agency to hire people, the family does the interviewing and they pay the service. But the nurse can really help out with that interview process. We can tell who's going to be good and who isn't from an interview and on the job training kind of thing. So there's the ongoing situation, and then there will be a change in condition, and the patient will be considered in the dying phase. And then the nurse will be there 7 days a week to check in on them. All the while here, we're talking about the teaching, the writing everything down in whatever language you need it. We'll provide you the medications, the descriptions, the frequency, the dosage. And then when a patient becomes unconscious and their symptoms are managed, in my opinion, that's called the grace of the dying process. If we have been giving the medications properly to treat their symptoms, they're not suffering. They're not yet dead, but they're not expressing pain. We're not seeing the nonverbal expression of pain, agitation, discomfort. We're managing their breathing, using oxygen or morphine. Even a fan in the room can help them feel less anxiety. They're not telling us this, but we'll observe the behavior changes to show that they might have less anxiety. And then when a patient dies, the family will sit there with the patient for a few minutes, make sure, especially if you're dealing with children. I had an experience once where the heartbeat stopped, the breathing stopped, and 15 minutes later, this 12-year-old started breathing again. And 15 minutes after she stopped breathing again, she started breathing again. And it was my first experience with a child dying, and their heart just wasn't ready to let go. So after they have confirmed that the circulation stopped, the heart stopped, because that's the last thing to stop, they call the agency. The agency sends a nurse over. It could be a chaplain or a social worker as well, because any one of us have been given the authority to recognize that someone has actually died. The authority figures have recognized that. During the course of the incorporation of agencies, the do not resuscitate became a valuable tool. If they have a do not resuscitate that says when their heart and their respiration stop, they do not want to be resuscitated, the family doesn't have to call an agency, 911, emergency services, to come do that validation. We can officially pronounce and let the funeral home or crematorium come and get them. So it is, it's wonderful to appreciate the sacredness of this time from beginning to end. I believed in that and I felt it, and I made sure the family understood that I believed in that and I felt it. And I gave them the kind of consideration and attention they needed. Of course, the social worker and chaplain attend to those spiritual needs on one level, but the entire team has to say how deeply we appreciate being invited into their home to help them care for their loved one at this time in the life. So it's when I go to the house after the death, I make sure to pull the covers up over. I stay there for a minute or two. I say my own little prayer and gratitude to the family and to this empty bed that was lived in by somebody who gave tremendous amounts to the world, and now this time of their life is over. So it's I felt it was important to feel that way and know that way and be able to express it to families. And then the funeral home comes and they take the person away, and the bereavement services are available for 13 months after the death.
Hi, Barbara. Thank you so much. I have a question about DNR versus all the stories we've heard about folks. You just mentioned one who has apparently revived on their own after all the signs of life seem to have departed, and that includes folks who've been revived in their casket even.
Mm-hmm.
after quite some time. And also in cases where there have been near-death experiences and folks have wanted to come back and would have been pronounced dead, etc., and perhaps their organs removed if they had that that sort of a bequest. How do you deal with that question, or is that dealt with in the world of hospice?
Actually, no, it's not, because our job is to make sure that we do our best to create a peaceful death by managing the physical symptoms that the person goes through.
Mm-hmm.
If after the death they are revived, so in the case of that 12-year-old, I was still at the house.
Mm.
So I attended to their needs. If that happens after we have left the house, then it has to be dealt with by the family and the funeral home or the crematorium or wherever it is. Our active part in all of that is over. And that may be hard to recognize, but it's important that I do my job and then someone else has that job for taking care of them. It can be the bereavement services, the social workers and the chaplains who are part of the bereavement team who get called in to talk with the family. I would be shocked if they weren't. But it literally has not happened in my experience, other than this one 12-year-old. But again, I was there. Did that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Okay.
Barbara, what's the difference between palliative care and hospice care?
Thank you. Another good question. Palliative care is the attention towards the symptoms. It is given by a doctor or a nurse practitioner. Nurse practitioners at a master's level of education can prescribe and treat patients. Their work is under the supervision of an MD, but someone can be actively pursuing their treatment for a disorder and get palliative care, because palliative care and hospice are much, 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 much more aggressive about giving medications that can treat symptoms. It has been a world of fantastic education to discover we don't have to change medications on a 4 to 6 hour level. We can give medications sooner if we know the way they are given and how the body responds. The legal opportunities to use medications more frequently are relevant in palliative care and hospice and other places, other care by other doctors. It just isn't very well known. Palliative care has gotten a reputation by people who say, well, you know what, I'm really not comfortable with the idea of hospice. It scares me. So I think what I'll do is have palliative care first. And then maybe I'll accept the idea of hospice later. But I'm just too uncomfortable about it. That's not okay, because palliative care offers you the medical care of a doctor or a nurse practitioner only. Hospice agencies provide all those services I've been talking about and the attention 24/7 to you and your family, so that you are given the full Monty of care for your dying condition. People in palliative care don't have to be dying. They could just have a very difficult medical situation that requires aggressive use of medications to solve your problem. Many patients in hospice will receive a visit by a palliative care nurse, because every agency has a palliative care nurse on staff as well, because they may need to be called in to identify a different medication that could be given to treat that symptom. So then the palliative care person becomes a member of the hospice team. But palliative care is separate, and it should not be encouraged as a stepping stone to hospice for emotional or psychological reasons. Does that answer that?
I'm not sure. The last part, it should not be encouraged.
It should not be encouraged as a stepping stone. If somebody
okay.
needs hospice, they need hospice. We shouldn't
Right.
delay them getting
Right. Okay. I see your point.
by saying, oh, well, we'll just placate your fear right now and let you start with palliative care. No,
Yes.
no.
Okay.
We want you to appreciate all the avenues of care in hospice and not limit yourself to just
Right.
one visit a week by a palliative care nurse.
Excellent.
Hey, Barbara, can you clarify? And I don't know across the country or globally if it's the same, but my understanding, and I may very well be wrong, so please feel free to correct me. In my understanding, if a patient they can be in palliative care and still be treated with curative intent. And whereas with hospice, I have to be no longer treated with, one, I can't be treated with curative intent, two, 6 months to live, 6 months or less to live, and three, and this is the scary part that I've bumped up against with families is once they're at home in hospice, they can't call the ambulance and go to the hospital generally. I mean, you could, but there's some ways that you can sort of get kicked out of hospice if you sort of go to, be resuscitated or whatever. So can you sort of, I know that's some nuanced things, but can you clarify that? Because I think it can be confusing for people.
I think those are great questions, and I'm sorry I didn't remember to say in hospice, you do have to say, I will no longer get curative care. So you were right about that. It is a distinction between the two. And the other question was when somebody has a fall or a scary medical condition for which they say, I really want to call 911. I feel I need to go to the hospital. From day one, from admission to hospice, we educate the family and the patient to call us first so that we can help determine if your situation requires an emergency room visit. If the patient, for instance, fell and there's a possible broken leg, broken hip, broken arm, that is separate from their hospice diagnosis, and they absolutely and truly do deserve that medical care for that injury. When that happens, it's happened that we have to be Johnny on the spot to get to the house and deal with discharging them from hospice for that term that they're going to be in the hospital, because hospitals have taken advantage of people in hospice and charged the hospice agency for the medical care that had nothing to do with hospice. So we've learned over the years to be very, very careful about distinguishing who's paying the bills and taking responsibility for letting the family know. We ask you not to call 911, to call us first. And it is for this reason. And that's one of the unpopular truths about hospice, is that it really is a business. We have to be careful who we admit. We have to be careful that every 60 or 30 days they meet criteria to continue in hospice. And we have to be very careful about trips to the emergency room. So that 24/7 on-call nurse with a triage nurse available,
Right.
you can call in 24 hours a day and speak with an experienced hospice nurse who will answer your questions. We want people to call in right away. We don't want you to wait overnight thinking, oh, I just don't want to disturb them in their sleep. Disturb us, wake us up, have us answer your questions so that you're not stressed until the next morning or the next day when the nurse comes. In those phone calls, oh, he just fell, I need to call 911. We will talk you through how to evaluate that situation. Maybe we will say, call the non-emergency fire department, because they can pick him up and put him back in bed. They will do an assessment to determine if he's in a critical situation or he just fell out of bed and you can't pick him up. So the non-emergency fire departments in all the communities have been used to doing that for a long time. And if that situation requires, if the family is scared because they have a change in symptom, we will find out what's that change in symptom. We will have the computer available to look at all the medications. We can recommend a medication be given. We will call back 30 minutes later to say, how did it work? We will call back 30 minutes later to say, how are you doing after this crisis? We don't want you to be any more afraid either. So all of those kinds of assessments have to be given 24 hours a day for families who have questions and problems. And
Thank you for coming today, Barbara, and talking to us. It's an important topic. My experience in the States is that even among very educated people, there's a hesitancy or an absolute reluctance to involve hospice because it's like it's giving up. And they have to be really, they wait until the individual is way too far gone when it would have been helpful to the individual and the family to have involved hospice much earlier in the process when perhaps the doctor first mentioned it, but they resist because it's this, well, we're giving up on her or him. And I'm wondering if it's like that in other countries or if they're more enlightened about the advantages of involving hospice earlier in the dying process.
I can't answer for what other countries are experiencing, but you're absolutely right. There is a tremendous fear about it, which is why I wrote the book. But I don't know how many people are going to get it and read it ahead of time the way it was meant.
I watched a video yesterday with the hospice worker David Parker, and he described a bunch of situations. But before I get into that, I'd like to know who determines where you end up and what type of hospice. Sounds like you're talking mostly about hospice care in the home, where Mr. Parker was talking about working quite a bit in institutional hospice. So have you got any experience with institutions, and who would determine which type you would end up in?
Well, in the United States, there are independent inpatient units owned and operated by medical groups, hospice agencies that have got tremendous amounts of donors to help them pay for someone living in a freestanding building and getting hospice care for possibly weeks or months. According to the Medicare regulation here is that the only time we can pay for you to go into an institution for the intensive care that is called continuous care is because you have symptoms that are so bad, you have symptoms that need management at a higher level of care. So some agencies rent space from a nursing home, some agencies built their own independent buildings, freestanding buildings with hospice beds and nursing staff and everything else. And there are other places that have opened up hospice institutions for people who could pay for their own room and board for a long period of time. If you are a Medicare recipient or an insurance recipient who are paying your Medicare bills in America, they're not interested in paying for you to go into a very much more expensive place. If a skilled nursing facility will do, that is the primary place that families will go who have no way to take care of their own family member at home. But the families who can take care of their own family member at home, either with their own family members providing all the care or hiring an independent agency of aides to come and care for the person, those are the two most popular, most often used venues for a patient to have their hospice care.
So if you're an elderly single person that has no family, where you're likely to end up?
In a skilled nursing facility, and if on Medicaid, which is the
lowest.
The payer,
What you can afford.
What you can afford. Thank you. When you can't afford to hire your own people, you have no assets. Medicaid covers.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome.
I am one of those volunteers you talked about, and I have a comment that I think will benefit everybody here. Yesterday, I saw this guy that I've been seeing in his house for about 4 months, and he's getting towards the end. And for the hour that I was there, he talked about that he was seeing his wife when I was sitting there, and they were on a boat, and it was just fantastic. I could ask him questions, and he would answer me. And then when it was time for me to leave, I talked to his daughter that's taking care of him because his wife had passed, and she's totally on board with those deathbed visions that the guy's having. So what you're saying is exactly true. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to mention that there was an Anglican nun in England who started a hospice for children in Oxford. This was in 1982. Helen and Douglas House. You can look it on YouTube, on the internet. And she said she found this was difficult because saying goodbye to a child was so very, very difficult. And she had the parents stay with the child in the hospice, even after the child had died, because then they could see that the child was no longer there. This was now a shell. So they could bury the shell. They weren't burying their baby, because this was really agony. And it was absolutely fantastic, because she said the difference it made. She waited until the parents could see that this was not a living child anymore.
That's beautiful.
And it helped greatly. And I just checked it, and I see it's inspired 54 others across England.
Well, England's with Dame Cicely Saunders in 48. She started the thinking about hospice care. I am thrilled that there's more available in England. I wish that there was more available in the United States. I just know that money is such an issue for here that we can't have as many independent facilities, but so if there's an agency that has extraordinary amounts of donors to help them pay their bills, they can afford to build an independent facility and keep people as long as they want. It's not common, it's rare.
Part 2 of David Parker, the hospice care worker. He described working in facilities where they would get infants. He said one of the reasons, it's kind of weird, sort of insurance reasons, that hospitals do not want to try to take care of people that they think are going to die. It looks bad on their stats.
Well, I have an entire section in my book about that.
And what he was saying, and maybe you can back this up, is if it looked like they were operating on somebody, let's say, or they just realized they couldn't, send them home in some sort of a healthy way, they would suggest hospice almost immediately so that they didn't die on their watch.
That's correct.
And also the other part too of this is he worked in a place where they got really young infants. I mean, almost right after birth. And he said a lot of them in young children, they would only last a few days, maybe a week or two. And they were seeing all kinds of spirits that he couldn't see, even though he was psychic. But talk about that a little bit.
Well, let me think back to what I was thinking about with your first point.
Well, they're kicking people out into hospice so they didn't have to bear the death on the hospital stats.
So this is in general in nursing homes around in Illinois where I am. The management and the payer sources of the nursing homes, they just can't seem to get a grasp on the fact that many people choose to live there because they don't have someplace else to live and they can pay for it. Many people live there because they can't afford to live anywhere else, and they're not necessarily ill and dying.
Oh.
It becomes a problem if they become ill and start dying when the agency that supports the overarching agency will look upon the staff and blame them for the death. It's like it's not okay to get old and die while living in a nursing home.
Right.
If the condition of a person changes and the nursing staff say, I think we're dealing with a hospice patient now, then they will hurry up and bring hospice in, and we will care for them. And then their bottom line on their accounting books will show that hospice was involved and they managed the care. So this person died, but he died under hospice. It wasn't our fault. And there's this terrible reality of many people not being recognized for hospice early enough, or an agency saving their bottom line by saying, oh, well, let's get somebody in hospice real quick. So that's true.
That makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
Yes, since David told his story, I was sitting with my niece as my mom was in a coma at the end, and my mom had not moved or said anything for a long, long time, and all of a sudden she was very animated in the bed, and she said, "I see all 5." And my niece looked at me. I've told this story before. My niece looked at me and she said, 5. You know, she was whispering, and I said she had 5 siblings, and so my niece went, "Oh." And then my mom calmed down, and she was very quiet for a long time. And it wasn't too long after that, she said, "Oh, 7." And my niece goes, 7? And I went, yeah, 5 siblings and her parents. The whole family's here. And my mom passed not too long after that.
That is wonderful.
Yeah. It's interesting because the siblings, one was Sid's death very early on. But evidently, all the siblings had gotten together, even the one that had died as an infant on the other side, and they all came for her.
Oh, wow. I love that.
Right? Yeah, me too.
You're welcome.
Yes, I have a question of just a slightly different type. As the body dies, I believe that hearing is one of the last things to go. I was with my mother. She had a major stroke the day before my birthday. I met her at the hospital. She was unresponsive. She was given like 36 hours, 24 to 36 hours to live. And in the hospital, I don't know what made me think of this, but I wanted her to be free. I wanted her to be able to go. I didn't want to be hanging on to her. As I've heard other people, sometimes we hang on to people and they really need to go. And I kneeled over and I whispered in her ear, "Mom, you can go," whatever, you know, however I said that. And her breathing changed. It's like she heard me. I want to know that she heard me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a few hours later that she went.
Thank you. That's a good example. Because it's very true that the touch, the smell, the sound of certain people's voices will make a difference, and you can see a physical change in their relaxation response, their breathing. A grimace will change. They might smile. They might squeeze a finger, whereas 10 minutes before we thought they were in a coma. So that's one of many examples. Yes. Which you probably, most of you who know about mediumship and NDEs, you will have more knowledge about that than me.
I've worked as a nurse in palliative care in Sydney and also actually in China as well, in a children's hospice. So everything you're saying is making sense. But my question is, and if it's not appropriate, please say so, in Australia now we're starting to bring in the assisted dying laws. And I'm just wondering what your opinion or, you know, what you think about that as far as palliative care and assisted dying, you know, whether they're hand in hand or two separate things.
No, they can go hand in hand. There are many states that have the right to die rules. They have been established as acceptable, and medical doctors will or will not agree to that when a patient comes and says, I am too afraid, so can you work with me so that I can administer my medication when I want to and end my life at when I want to. And since there was a Dr. Kevorkian who got that started, and I don't remember what year it was, but to date, less than 30% of people who sign up to do that is it. Because I think the surprise for most of those people is that hospice care is well managed, their symptoms are managed, the family's anxiety is managed, and they don't need to be as afraid as they thought they had to be.
Yeah, it's just like a guarantee. But it is interesting, the hospice that I'm involved in at the moment on a volunteer basis, they won't have anything to do with the assisted dying. They've told people they're not to talk about it, not to mention it. And if anybody does, goes to the manager. So yes, still a bit of a way to go.
So dovetail specifically to Lynn about that, and I wanted to ask you to speak to it, Barbara, but I want to give you a case in point. My brother passed away last May, and he was diagnosed last January with stage 4 metastatic everywhere melanoma. But even and I know you have to have seen this, even when you're given the house is engulfed in flames, you're going to die, this is going to be palliative only, he still wanted to fight, and he was going to give it the best he could to try to buy himself some time. And for those who aren't medically trained, he was never sick a day in his life, so he didn't have the language. And so by the time it got to, okay, this really is happening, I really am going to die, the process, so Colorado is a medical aid in dying state, but it's still a process. And the process is I have to go to my doc, I have to say, okay, I want to do this. You go home 2 weeks later, either they come to you or you go to them and you say, yes, I still want to do this. And then they have to call the prescription in to the compounding pharmacy that's going to concoct the medicine to send to you. So realistically, ballpark, it's going to be 3 weeks from start to finish for you to have that powder in your hands. And the reason why I mention it is because Mick really didn't want to have cancer choose when he died. He wanted to choose, but he was, due respect, he was in denial too long. And so realistically, if he could have gotten that medicine when he received the 6 months or less diagnosis and had the powder, even if he never used it, he was so enraged because by the time it got to be that he realized he wanted to make that choice, or even realized that it was a choice, it was too late. And I guess my reason for mentioning it is, if anyone you ever loved ends up in that situation, it's better to have the stuff and not use it than want it and not have it. But the only other thing, Barbara, which maybe you can speak to, is it isn't just stir some Kool-Aid in a glass, drink it, and abracadabra. It's more involved than that.
Yes, and they're, of course, hoping that to reduce the impulsivity of this idea and this thought and this need by stretching it out and having counseling go on, and the person can't do it alone. They have to have a family member who is agreeable to participate, not by giving the medicine, but by knowing that the person has accepted this idea and will and can give it themselves. So that point is written into some of the state's laws and not all of them. But I agree with you. But there's nothing, I had a patient once who was on high doses of morphine walking around as a cancer patient. And he said, how much would it take of this for me to kill myself? And I had to go talk to a pharmacist and find out. And there was an actual calculation involved because he was already on morphine. So how much more morphine would it be necessary to let him kill himself? And I went ahead and answered his question because his intellect at that point I was so aware that he was making a conscious discussion about it. It was not an impulsive move, and he didn't use it, but he could have. So we have our own attitudes about it, the medical profession, the insurance profession, the legal profession. It's too many people feel that they should be in charge, and that's tough.
And the only other thing I'd say, Barbara, is it's important with medical aid in dying, if you're in the United States, to familiarize yourself with the laws in your state. In Colorado, I don't know if it's everywhere, but in Colorado, someone else cannot administer the substance. You have to be able to administer it yourself. So be very clear that you need to educate yourself.
I think that's standard, is that you have to admit it yourself. Otherwise, somebody's going to accuse somebody else.
We often hear about a patient leaving their body before they die, and that sometimes the relatives are concerned that the patient is making movements that indicate they're in pain, but actually they have left their body. We've also I've had stories of people from the other side saying that they come and go, that they're sometimes out of their body, they're sometimes in their body, and patients often, their relatives are often not aware of this. They're often unduly concerned. Is that something you've observed?
Well, what you're describing may be the reality of what happens when people have a terrible time with agitation behavior.
Mm.
We end up medicating them to relax them, but none of us has ever known exactly what was going on. Neurologists want to say it's the change in the metabolic, the acidosis that's causing their nerves to react. Others have said they're reliving a life, and so there are times when they get agitated. We end up using the medication on a regular basis, every 4 to 6 hours, to subdue them, because we have observed that those who are agitated take longer to die, and it's more uncomfortable for them and everybody else watching. We don't set it up so that everybody else watching has a nicer time about it, but the truth is some agitation behavior comes and goes, and some is every 20 minutes for 2 or 3 days. So maybe that's what's going on, but do I have experience knowing it? No. I'm not a medium who's actually done that sort of observation.
There was one other thing I wanted to share, that sometimes it's not only family members that come to help a soul to cross. When my son-in-law's father died, he had spent years working in forestry, voluntarily going around clearing the vines. And when the son sat with him after he died, he was aware of divas who had come to collect him. And he said it was the most incredible moment that,
I'm going to have to look up diva because I can't even relate to that. But somebody besides family members?
Nature spirits, guardians of the forest had come to collect him. Yeah.
It's wonderful.
I thought that was lovely.
Yes, just to say, this was with my brother in Florida about 20 years ago, that he was on dialysis and ICU, and he just got tired and said, he asked me to come visit, so I was there. And he just said to the nurse, "My 3 women are now here, my wife, my daughter, my sister. I'm tired, please pull the plug." No, yes, I've had enough, I'm ready to go.
Good for him.
So they transferred him to the hospice wing. And we were there for some days, visiting and having very good time chatting. And then he simply passed.
Good for him.
Very, very comfortable. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the stories in my book about knowing they're going to die is a cardiac patient who was up and around an ambulatory and eating her own meals and everything. And while talking about hospice care, she said, many people end up in diapers. That's not going to happen to me. I'd rather die before I end up dependent on a diaper. And one afternoon, her son, who came every day to make sure she got her food and stuff, she became incontinent, and she had to have him help her in the bathroom. And the next morning, she was dead. So people can know when it's time.